What I'd like to talk about this morning is what's called the mystery of anti-Semitism. The source of anti-Semitism. Where exactly does it come from? Let's start off with the definition of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism can be defined as follows: an irrational and transgenerational hatred for the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Would you all agree that we see anti-Semitism in our world today? We heard all the characters in the last session. But the gentleman on the left there, anybody recognize that individual on the far left? Yeah, that's Martin Luther, one of our heroes. So anti-Semitism can come from unlikely sources. Here's a statement that Martin Luther made at the end of his life in written form. He said of the Jews, first, their synagogues should be set on fire. Secondly, their homes should likewise be broken down and destroyed. Thirdly, they should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmuds. Fourthly, their rabbis must be forbidden under threat of death to teach anymore. Fifthly, passport and traveling privileges should be absolutely forbidden to the Jews. Sixthly, they ought to be stopped from charging usury, interest on loans. Seventh, let the young and strong Jews and Jewesses be given the flail, the axe, the hoe, the spade, the distaff, and the spindle, and let them earn their bread by the sweat of their noses. We ought to drive their rascally lazy bones out of our system, therefore away with them. To sum up, dear princes and nobles who have Jews in your domains, if this advice of mine does not suit you, then find a better one so that we may be free of this insufferable burden, devilish burden, the Jews. Thus saith Martin Luther. John Calvin was a little bit more restrained in his comments about the Jews, but you can see the same mindset in his writings. He says in his commentary on the book of Daniel concerning a rabbi that he was interacting with, but here the rabbi not only betrays his ignorance, but his utter stupidity, since God has so blinded the whole people that they were like restive dogs. I have had much conversations with many Jews, and I have never seen either a drop of piety or a grain of truth or ingenuousness. Nay, I have never found common sense in any Jew. But this fellow who seems so sharp and ingenious displays his own impudence to his great disgrace. This comes from someone like myself that has great respect for both Martin Luther and John Calvin. And yet, John Calvin and Martin Luther, while they made great contributions to the historic Christian faith, did not invent anti-Semitism. It was alive and well in the Middle Ages, but they dragged it with them into the Reformed movement. Now, we've already heard a lot, haven't we, about Yasser Qadi and the James White Beyond Debate dialogue in a church. James White called Yasser Qadi his mentor, and actually told Yasser Qadi that you ought to make a movie to educate us Christians about Islam. You want to know some of the views of Yasser Qadi? Direct quote: as for 80 to 90% of the Jews in our times, they are Ashkenazi Russians. Look at them, white crooked nose, blonde hairs. This is not the descendants of Jacob. These are not Semitic people. Look at them. They don't look like Semites, and they are not Semites. And by the way, Hitler never intended to destroy the Jews. There are a number of books out written by Christians on this. You should read them. One of them he recommends is The Hoax of the Holocaust. He says the evidences are very strong. They're talking about newspaper articles, clippings, everything. Look it up for yourself. What Hitler really wanted to do. But the Jews, the way they portray him, that's Hitler, is also incorrect. I think James White needs to do a better job selecting his mentors. Amen. And I share these quotes with you just to show you, and we saw it in the last presentation, this transgenerational hatred for the Jews. Where in the world does this come from? What I'd like to convince you of this morning, based on a verse-by-verse study of Revelation chapter 12, is there's actually an angelic motivation. Anti-Semitism does not come from the philosophies of the human mind. It's ultimately found in the recesses of hell itself. It's a philosophy spawned by the devil and his fallen angels. And when I begin to talk like this, of course, to the Bible-believing Christian is no surprise, because the Bible tells us all of the time that there is an invisible spiritual war all around us. Do you believe that? Ephesians 6 and verse 12 says we wrestle not against what? Flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and rulers of this dark world. In fact, if you were to look up all those scriptures, you would see very clearly that the Bible tells us about the invisible spiritual war that is taking place within us. And one of the reasons I like Revelation 12 so much is it's one of those chapters of the Bible, like some of these others, that pulls back the veil and allows us as mere mortals to see into the invisible spiritual conflict. And in the process, Revelation 12 reveals the two great strategies of the devil. Did you know the devil has strategies? Paul the Apostle in 2 Corinthians 2, verse 11, of Satan says we are not ignorant of his schemes. The devil has two great schemes. There is a past scheme related to the first coming of Christ that has failed. There is and that's in verses 1 through 5 of Revelation 12. That scheme is revealed to us. There is a second scheme yet to come, destined to fail, related to the second coming of Christ, and you'll find that in Revelation 12, verses 6 through 17. A past scheme, a future scheme. And once you see the scheme, then presentations like the one we just saw about this irrational Jew hatred in our world. It's been in our world for many, many years. It's in our world today. It'll be in our world until Jesus comes back. You start to see exactly where all of this comes from. So that's why we're looking this morning at the source of anti-Semitism. Let's start with the past scheme.